They're scrambling to find a bill that they can pass on the floor. I don't know if you want to call this, on Trump's part, a rookie's error, but you don't find a day and say we're going to pass a bill. You build your consensus in your caucus, and when you're ready, you set the date to bring it to the floor. Rookie's error, Donald Trump. You may be a great negotiator. Rookie's error for bringing this up on a day when clearly you're not ready.
Nancy Pelosi earlier today, twisting the knife. And say what you will about Nancy Pelosi, even her sworn political enemies will tell you that she knows how to count. She knows how to count votes, and she knows how to hold Democrats together. You haven't heard much, have you, about Democrats planning on voting with the Republicans to repeal Obamacare, right? That's because there aren't any Democrats planning on voting with Republicans on this. None. Republicans didn't even try to get Democrats to vote with them on this. They were sure they could do it all on their own. After all, they do have a big Republican majority in the House, right? This is their big idea. Well, as of right now, Republicans haven't taken the vote they said they would take on this tonight. They pulled it. They instead say they plan to vote on it tomorrow, whether they have the votes or not. Here was Paul Ryan just a few minutes ago.
Hi, everybody. For 7.5 years, we have been promising the American people that we will repeal and replace this broken law because it's collapsing and it's failing families. And tomorrow we're proceeding.
You have the vote? You have the vote?
That's the press conference equivalent of tweeting. He's like, I've only got 140 characters here. I'm out. You can hear reporters at the end there shouting, do you have the votes? Do you have the votes? And, you know, passing legislation unilaterally through a chamber you control shouldn't be that hard, especially when you've been gearing up for it and practicing for it for 7 straight years. Apparently, it's harder than they thought. That said, if they do end up wrangling the votes by tomorrow morning, their job for getting rid of Obamacare will only get harder from here on out. In the Senate, there are at least a dozen Republican senators who either oppose the bill or lean against it. If so many as 2 of them vote no, this thing is in very, very, very deep trouble. Joining us now is Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders. Senator Sanders, thank you so much for being with us tonight. It's nice to see you.
Good to see you, Rachel.
What is your understanding of the process at this point? Where is what's the status of the effort to repeal Obamacare, both in terms of the House and if it does get out of the House once it gets to your chamber?
Well, you know, as you've indicated, they control the situation. I think if they have the votes, Ryan will bring it up tomorrow. If they don't, they won't bring it up. I don't understand why you would bring it up to lose. They're going to have a different set of circumstances in the Senate. And our job is to do everything that we can to explain to the American people in Kentucky, in West Virginia, in Arizona, in Nevada, and all of these so-called red states, what a disaster this plan would be to their lives. To explain to them that Donald Trump, and many of them voted for Trump, lied to them when he said he was going to protect the interests of working people. You don't throw 24 million people off of health insurance. You don't tell seniors that their premiums are going to soar. You don't cut Medicaid, which not only will impact low-income people, but it will impact middle-income people whose parents are in nursing homes. You don't cut Medicaid by almost $900 billion. And by the way, in the midst of all of that, give $300 billion in tax breaks to the top 2% and more tax breaks to the drug companies and the insurance companies. So our job right now, and you're seeing this all over the country, some of the clips that you presented indicate this. People are catching on, and they are telling their Republican representatives, do not sell us out. Do not let my mother die because she can't afford health care under your plan. And our job is to accelerate that effort, to get people to stand up and fight back in a way that we have not seen in the modern history of this country. Because, Rachel, if they get away with this, they're going to keep on coming. And it will be Social Security next. It'll be the Veterans Administration after that, et cetera, et cetera. This is a war against the working people. And our job is to stand up and tell the billionaire class they're not going to kill thousands of people with a terrible proposal like this.
Senator, your your greatest skill in politics, your whole orientation toward politics, is to bring Washington basically before the American people, to make the concerns of the country resonate in Washington in a way that they don't through normal and corporate political power channels. You've been a real organizer around these things, and I feel like I'm watching two eventualities that you would have hoped and prayed for whether or not you expected them. We've got 17% approval rating nationwide for this bill that you just described in such devastating terms. We have seen unprecedented activism, not just against the administration broadly, but in favor of saving the Affordable Care Act in not just every state in the country, but every congressional district in the country. Sustained, intense human activism on this stuff. And yet, it's close. It may pass the House tomorrow. What are we learning through this process, seeing the civic engagement in the American people on this issue, about the way that translates to Washington and about how you can make that concern and that passion into political outcomes in D.C.?
Rachel, what we are seeing is that when the American people begin to move, you know, Republicans historically had their town meetings and 30 or 50 of their friends would show up and they talk about cutting the deficit and cutting Social Security and Medicare, and everybody would applaud. But now you're seeing people coming and saying, as you heard on one of your clips, if you do this, my wife is going to die, and I'm not going to let you do that. And you're seeing members of Congress, Republicans, having to sneak out the back door or claim, I'm worried about my safety. I can't even hold a town meeting. And that is our goal. I want to give you one example. I want you to think about this. You have a state like Kentucky. It is a poor state, a struggling state. It has been one of the major beneficiaries, along with West Virginia, of the Affordable Care Act. And by the way, let's be clear, the Affordable Care Act has significant problems. I believe in a Medicare for All single-payer program. But you got West Virginia, Kentucky. The rate of uninsured people has gone way, way down. Far fewer people are now uninsured. And you have, say, in Kentucky, Mitch McConnell advocating and leading the effort to end the Affordable Care Act. The question is, how does he think he could get away with, in his own state, throwing hundreds of thousands of people off health insurance? And the reason he thinks he can get away with that, and likely can get away with it, is there is no opposition. Democratic Party is feeble, unable to fight back. So our job, not just on health care, but in a broad sense, is to bring the American people together, to bring the working people of this country together and say, you know what, Mitch, you're not going to give tax breaks to billionaires and throw my wife or my kids off of health insurance. We can do it, but we need a political revolution in this country. We need to have the guts to go into Kentucky and West Virginia and Arizona and Alaska and Maine and Nevada and start bringing those people together. If we do that, we can not only defeat this Republican proposal, I believe we can move to a Medicare for all single-payer system. I believe we can have progressive taxation, demanding Trump and his billionaire friends start paying their fair share of taxes, raise the minimum wage to a living wage, et cetera, et cetera. This is a pivotal moment in American history. Either these guys get away with what they're doing and decimate our people, or else we stand up, fight back, and transform the American society.
Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont. Senator, there is another fight in Washington that has landed on your doorstep, the nomination of a Supreme Court nominee from this president. I understand that Democrats are sort of planning a new stage of that fight. Would you mind sticking around for one more question on that subject, sir?
Sure.
All right. Senator Bernie Sanders will be back with us to respond to this news that the Democrats intend to cross a Rubicon and filibuster Supreme Court nomination from President Trump. Senator Sanders back with us right after this. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.
Okay, it's time to discuss the legislative leadership and powers of the presidency. And it is impossible to exaggerate the enormity of what happened to Donald Trump today. His presidency effectively ended today. He will retain the office, of course, but not the powers, because he demonstrated today that he has none. He is a powerless president. The president will, of course, still have commander-in-chief authority over the machinery of war, but he has exercised more authority over the machinery of golf since becoming president than he has military activities. The rest of the presidency is about international relations, in which this president is already an abject failure, unwilling to even shake hands with one of our most important allies. The president's most important executive orders have been blocked by federal courts, and now, the president has lost his first big legislative battle. And that is a sentence I have never said before. The president has lost his first big legislative battle. They all win those battles. And they win them because their parties unify behind the president. That's the way it always works on the first big bill, and usually for most of the first year at least. Not now. The members of Donald Trump's own party in the House of Representatives and the Senate do not care what he thinks. They do not care what he wants. He has proved himself incapable of changing their minds, incapable of commanding their loyalty, incapable of commanding their respect. And why would they respect him? Here's what he was doing yesterday after he publicly gave up trying to win support for his own bill. And so tonight, the president, who has already proven himself to be the laziest, most ignorant president in history, is now the weakest. Nothing will get through Congress because Donald Trump wants it to get through Congress. The Republicans will probably get a tax cut through Congress because they've had a tax cut ready to go since before Donald Trump ran for president. And tax cutting is the one kind of legislation that Republicans do know how to get done. But it won't be Donald Trump's tax cut. He will be completely irrelevant to the process. It will be Paul Ryan's tax cut negotiated with Mitch McConnell, and Donald Trump will sign it, because all Donald Trump is now to this Congress is the rubber stamp for what they choose to pass. Mitch McConnell will do everything he can to confirm a Supreme Court justice who was not chosen by Donald Trump, but was simply a name on a list handed to Donald Trump during the campaign, a list of names Donald Trump had never seen before. He was told that you get to pick one of these. That's it. Donald Trump is the most powerless president we have ever seen, and nothing can change that because it is who he is. He is a weak president because he is a weak person, weak of mind, lazy, undisciplined, reckless, and ignorant to the point that he amazed Republican House members in private conversations. And remember, Republican members of the House of Representatives are the least knowledgeable people in government about health care policy. And one of them told Ryan Lizza at the New Yorker, ours astonished how in over his head Trump is. He seems to neither get the politics nor the policy of this. That was the word from inside a private Republican meeting with the president on the health care bill. Republicans in the House have now seen Donald Trump up close trying to make the deal, and it was very clear to every one of them that he did not understand a single word of the deal. He had no idea what he was talking about. Some members of the Trump staff whispered to reporters that it was easier to negotiate with Congress without Trump. Of course it was, because Trump was telling everyone who came through the door what they wanted to hear. And in Congress, that means you can never, ever get a deal because you're going to have to be able to say no to someone on what he or she wants and still get that person to vote for your bill. That is the only way bills like this get passed. Members of Congress vote for a bill that they don't like very much because their president needs them to do it. That's how Bill Clinton got his first big bill passed by exactly one vote in the House of Representatives and in the Senate. There was very little in it for Democrats to like. It was a big tax increase along with big spending cuts in Medicare and Medicaid, all to reduce the deficit. But Democrats voted for it in the end. And what put the bill over the top was the belief among Democrats in the House and Senate that if their president lost on his first big bill, his presidency would be instantly irrelevant. That's how Bill Clinton got to 51 votes in the Senate. The last 10 Democrats to come on that bill did so only to save Bill Clinton's presidency. It was a hard vote for them. But that argument always works. Whenever Democrats or Republicans in Congress need it, we have to pass the president's first big bill or his presidency will be irrelevant. That argument has always been right, and that argument has always worked. Until today. Republicans in the House do not care about the Trump presidency, and they proved that today by crushing the Trump presidency into irrelevance. Today, the resistance against President Trump won, and the resistance this time, on this day, was completely Republican. President Trump is now a man without a party in a government that only has two parties. Trump voters were convinced that Donald Trump could push Congress around, that any member of Congress who crossed Donald Trump would have his or her political career instantly destroyed by a Trump tweet. Trump would fire off those tweets like drone strikes into the congressional districts of those members. The Congress would live in fear of Donald Trump. When the president got tired of negotiating on the health care bill, he issued the ultimatum to the Republican House that it was time to vote. It was time to shut up and vote. And if they didn't vote for the Trump bill this time, they would not get another chance. The ultimatum laid it all on the line for President Trump, and now we know what a Donald Trump ultimatum means to congressional Republicans. Absolutely nothing. President Trump has the lowest approval rating of any president in the first 2 months, at 37% in the latest poll, and that is now a higher job approval rating than President Trump has with his own Republican Congress. Today, Donald Trump did what no president before him has publicly done on health care reform. He quit. He gave up. He could have said, we're going to spend the weekend working on this bill and see if we can bring it to a vote next week, and if we can't do that, we'll keep working on it until we can bring it to a vote. That's what you're supposed to say. The last big health care legislation ended in a signing ceremony at the White House. The one before that ended in 1994 with no bill. President Clinton's bill, managed by Hillary Clinton, didn't make it through Congress. It made it through the relevant committees, but it never came to a vote on the floor of the House or the Senate. Remember Bill Clinton's speech the day he surrendered on health care the way Donald Trump did today? Do you remember Hillary Clinton's speech the day that the Clintons surrendered to Congress on their health care crusade? No, you don't. Because they never surrendered. Not publicly. The Democrats kept drafting alternative compromises that they thought might be able to get through the House and the Senate well into September of that session, but no one ever publicly gave up on the Democratic side. And the truth is, you never have to admit complete defeat in Congress if you're willing to at least go through the motions of continuing to try, because the door never actually closes on legislation. But Donald Trump just gave up today, and that forced Paul Ryan to admit that they were giving up. We've been wondering since the election what it would take for Trump voters to realize the size of the fraud that they voted for. Donald Trump, the guy who said repealing and replacing Obamacare would be easy, spent less than 60 days trying to do it, and many of those days on the golf course before quitting, because, as he had to admit along the way, it was just too complicated. And more importantly, because he is the laziest, most ignorant, most incompetent, and now the most irrelevant president in history. Joining us now, Ezra Klein, the editor-in-chief of Vox.com. Also with us, Rick Wilson, Republican strategist and contributor to the Daily Beast. Ezra, Donald Trump realized, it seemed, 2-3 weeks ago, that this is complicated, and to the end, he apparently never understood just how complicated.
And this turned out to be a huge problem. One of the things that I kept hearing from people who had been in meetings with him, who had been part of his big ultimate closer push, was he would walk into the meetings and it was clear he had no idea how the bill worked. And I think when people hear that, it sounds funny, but it actually matters when you are doing this kind of big thing, when you are asking members of Congress to take a dangerous vote, you actually have to get them committed to something bigger than themselves. You have to convince them this is a big deal, that it is worth losing your seat over. That's what Obama did. He gave this speech to Democrats at the end of the Obamacare push. He said, this bill is worth losing your seat over. And Trump did not understand the bill, did not seem to like it very much, did not like to talk about it, and came in with a cynical political closing argument. If you don't vote for it, you'll lose your seat. And that is not enough to get people to vote for a bill that only has a 17% approval rating.
Yeah, that's, Ezra, I mean, the polls show exactly the opposite of the Trump threat. And Rick Wilson, everybody has the same access to those polls that Ezra just mentioned. You know, if you don't vote for this, you lose your seat. The polls said exactly the opposite. If you vote for this, you are taking an extreme risk with your seat.
Yeah, this was an existential choice for a lot of these guys, particularly in seats where Donald Trump did not overperform. These guys were looking at numbers where this bill was in the mid-20s to high teens in almost every case for approval. And the fact of the matter was the pressure on these folks from Donald Trump's minions and Donald Trump, the fear of the mean tweet, it diminished as the political reality set in, that no matter what you think about Obamacare, there was no way that Donald Trump was going to be a guy who could go out either in private or in public and articulate an argument for this bill that would move the numbers and would make sense. I mean, the emperor has been buck naked from the very beginning, but as Ezra noted, and I've talked to members who've been in these meetings, and they have said basically this guy has no clue whatsoever what he's talking about. He is easily overcome by inanimate objects and is much more comfortable being the presidential truck driver rather than somebody who could argue about a serious, consequential, complex bill like this.
Yeah, Ezra, historically in legislation like this or any of the complex legislation, you don't let anyone do any negotiating who isn't in complete command of the details. That's why most of this negotiating historically has been left to chairmen of the committees who know the material the best, the congressional leaders, and very rarely the president on specific issues, because the president is always, and this is no fault of the president, going to be less informed on the details than Congress is. And it certainly looked like some members were having conversations with Paul Ryan that were unsatisfactory, and then they would go down to the White House and have conversations with the president, and the president would say, yeah, I think you're right, I think we should try to do that, thereby undermining whatever Paul Ryan had just said to them. And so you had this two-headed monster of negotiation going on.
I think that's true, but I also think we shouldn't lose sight of the larger picture here. This was an atrocious bill.
Yes.
The reason, it was not just that Donald Trump did not know enough to make a good case for it. There wasn't a good case that could be made for it. If there was, somebody else could have been out there doing it. Paul Ryan could have been out there doing it. Secretary Tom Price could have been out there. Mike Pence could have been out there. Reince Priebus could have been out there. But there wasn't. When Heritage Action came out against the bill today, and Heritage Action, it's a conservative group. I mean, we are not talking about liberals here. They said, you got to vote against this bill because not a single conservative healthcare policy analyst is for it. This was a bill opposed by not just ARP, but the American Hospital Association, the American Medical Association. Anybody who knew anything about healthcare looked at this and said it was terrible. And not only was it bad, but it broke all of their promises. It broke Donald Trump's promises to give everybody health care and to make sure that care had lower deductibles. This was not what anybody wanted. And so even if Trump had known more about it, I think what that mainly would have done would have been to make him uncomfortable with the fact that this didn't accord with anything that he had said on health care.
Yeah, Ezra, that is such an important point to get us back focusing on what was actually in the bill. It was a disaster on its face. And Rick Wilson, I would add that to the issue of competence. The pushing a terrible bill is one of the signs of incompetence.
If you're a conservative, this bill looked. If you're a fiscal conservative, this bill looked like a disaster. If you're a market conservative, you look at this bill and say, wow, we've just reconfigured the giveaways to the insurance industry and pharma a little bit. We haven't done anything that's going to bring market forces in to reduce the premiums and to reduce the deductibles, to reduce the burdens that have been imposed on people by Obamacare. It doesn't fix anything, and it also, just from the look and feel of the thing, it's a disaster. It gives you every hook. If you're a Democrat, it gave you every hook to go after this bill about taking people off their insurance and maternity and mental health care, all these other things that just were immediate news hooks, and people understood them viscerally. And there was no effort to market this bill beyond the thought that Donald Trump would sell it to the public. I mean, that's like saying we're going to outsource, a daycare center to a team of serial killer clowns. It's ridiculous. You can't outsource something like this, that needs some heart and soul and some feel, that it isn't some heartless mechanism to throw people off their insurance. To Donald Trump, the guy with the least sympathetic affect of any human being.
Yeah, so they came up with a bill that couldn't be sold, and then they did everything wrong after that, too. Ezra Klein, Rick Wilson, Thank you both very much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.
First, on President Trump's job approval numbers this morning, the Gallup tracking poll, the daily poll, shows 39% approve of the job he's doing, with 56% disapproving. And new polling finds a majority of Americans oppose the Republican plan to repeal and replace Obamacare. According to a new Quinnipiac University poll, 56% disapprove. Whoa. Get this. Just 17% of Americans polled by Quinnipiac approve of this plan. A majority of voters, 61%, also disapprove of the way President Trump is handling this health care process. 20% of voters say the Affordable Care Act should be completely repealed. 50% say certain parts ought to be repealed. And 27% say it should be left intact. Joe, you put all those numbers together, a highly unpopular bill with an increasingly unpopular president doesn't bode well for the passage of this thing today.
No, I'm not good at this politics thing, Willie, but those numbers look really, really bad. Holy moly. Yeah, Mark Halperin, you were in the belly of the beast yesterday. You were like Zelig, straight out of the Woody Allen movie, where your face was implanted on every great moment of our time. No, you were everywhere. Talk about what the House members, how they were feeling, which way you thought this thing was going last night. Of course, we hear of a couple more defections overnight from some Arizona congressmen. What can you report to us back from everything you picked up in the belly of the beast yesterday?
Well, there's a certain grimness here that you saw in the face of lots of members throughout the day, and then certainly as they were leaving the meeting at night with administration officials. Mark Maddow is still pretty key here. The congressman from North Carolina, the head of the Freedom Caucus, actually was talking almost throughout the day yesterday as a constructive voice, saying, I'm going to work with moderates. Let's try to figure this out. I think there's still a chance they get it. But this gambit by the president is actually, I think, pretty smart, trying to make the best of a very bad situation. First of all, it could work. I think when the moment of truth comes today, if they've read the Wall Street Journal editorial, if they've listened to the administration, some members, even who are committed no, may decide, this is the last chance we have, the best chance we have. By threatening to move on, I think the president does a couple things. One is he puts a lot of pressure on them. It puts the onus on anyone who votes no today. They're basically saying, you are going to keep the Affordable Care Act in place. Two, it puts the onus more on Capitol Hill and less on the White House. And finally, and this is where I thought the president was in real trouble, by making a clean break, by saying basically, we're not going to try to revive health care, we're going to move on to tax reform, the president has a chance to keep the health care failure, if there is a failure today, from infecting the possibility of moving on. So members yesterday, I think, were saying this is not the president's fault. There's no doubt that this would be, the bottom line for the president would be, the art of the deal does not work under the current way the White House is doing it. That's why they still say failure is not an option. They're going to get it, and I think there's a chance they will.
It's preposterous, Willie, that Barack Obama took as long as he took to pass Obamacare, and they're trying to do this in the flash of an eye. It's preposterous for Donald Trump to think he can just walk in between honking 18-wheeler horns and pretending like he's driving on the White House lawn and shuttling back and forth for a couple of days. That's not how Washington works. It's just not. And even if he passes this bill, the negotiations have been such a wreck that he sabotaged it for the Senate.
Yeah, and yesterday was always an artificial deadline. And the significance of it being the 7th anniversary of signing Obamacare into law was something that they were looking at, but it left them a very small time frame to get this thing done. And yesterday, the most important man on Capitol Hill, perhaps Mark Meadows. He's the chair of the Freedom Caucus. As we said, Mark Halperin well positioned in that scrum around him following one of the negotiation meetings.
I think the procedures for going forward are still fundamental, and they have not changed for the last couple of weeks. If we can make sure that there is an adequate safety net, that pre-existing conditions are taken care of, where truly premiums start to go down for moms and dads, that's what it's all about. And I can tell you that that's what I heard over and over again, was does this bill actually lower premiums significantly enough to make a real difference for people that are struggling to pay for health care? And I think that we have that at the very core of where we are.
Carson, I know you're a modest man, but you basically have veto power over this, don't you?
No, I don't have any veto power. I have one vote. My voting card has my picture on it, but it doesn't belong to me. It belongs to the people of Western North Carolina. And so truly that is what motivates me.
The President Speaker passes without your support?
You know, again, I'm one vote. I can tell you at this point, we are trying to get another 30 to 40 votes that are currently in the no category to yes. Once we do that, I think we can move forward with passing it on the House floor.
Mark, Congressman Maddow is the subject, and the Freedom Caucus is the subject of a scathing editorial in today's Wall Street Journal, the Freedom from Reality Caucus. But yesterday, in speaking with a member of the White House staff, I was told that this bill that's going to be voted on today has now come down within the White House, within the Oval Office, to a kill Paul Ryan bill, because the president has never trusted Paul Ryan, and now the vote that he wants, that he's insisting upon today, is to get this done with, to get the speakership weakened and get the bill done with. What have you heard?
Well, there's certainly divisions now, despite the public show of being teammates, about what happened and what might happen next if the bill goes down, and even if the bill passes. You know, John Boehner was basically forced out of office by the Freedom Caucus. The Wall Street Journal editorial page and a lot of moderate House Republicans say the worst thing that could happen would be to pass this bill from the point of view of some, even though they do want it to pass, because the Freedom Caucus would just be emboldened. And those 40 or so members would be able to dominate every legislative fight, including tax reform, going forward. So there's some disagreements between the White House and Paul Ryan, for sure.
Well, and Mark Halperin, the opposite of that's true also, Mark Halperin. If the Freedom Caucus, after calling this Obamacare light, after having Heritage Foundation come out against it, after having Americans for Prosperity come out against it, after the Kochs saying we will fund any challenges from your political left against you in the primary process, coming out in support of them opposing what they've all called Obamacare light, if the Freedom Caucus folds today, they might as well fold up their tent for the next 2 years, because they will cease to be relevant in any negotiation.
Well, except, Joe, I'd say they have gotten a lot of changes in the bill that have occurred only because they have pushed for them. And I think they do believe that they can stand strong in negotiations with the Senate and continue to have influence. The reality of the Freedom Caucus is they do have a big enough number that they can dominate any legislative fight. And the question is, what's the best outcome for the White House here? Is it for the Freedom Caucus to be emboldened, or is it for them to be put in their place? One moderate Republican House member said to me yesterday that if the White House will rue the day if this bill passes the House, because the Freedom Caucus now will feel they can call the shots on every major legislative agenda going forward.
As I mentioned a few minutes ago, the New York Times reporting this morning, quote, Mr. Trump has told 4 people close to him he regrets going along with Speaker Paul D. Ryan's plan to push a health care overhaul before unveiling a tax cut proposal more politically palatable to Republicans. He said ruefully this week he should have done tax reform first when it became clear that the quick-hit health care victory he'd hoped for was not going to materialize on Thursday. Here is Sean Spicer 1 week ago.
Many conservatives are really concerned that Paul Ryan, Speaker of the House, is leading President Trump down a very long path on health care. Well, how do you react to that?
Donald Trump's not going to be led down a path by anyone. He's working hand in glove with the Speaker, but he doesn't get led down any paths. He leads very clearly, and I think if you listen to Speaker Ryan today, he's in agreement that there's been a strong partnership between the House, the administration, and I think the Senate so far to make sure that we get this bill done.
The Times also reports that two of the president's top advisors, Chief Strategist Steve Bannon and National Economic Council Director Gary Cohn, who had a major role in pushing health care reform, came to agree with Trump that he should have tackled tax reform first. The Times also notes, quote, Trump's son-in-law and senior advisor Jared Kushner, who's vacationing with his family in Aspen this week, has said for days that the bill was a mistake to support. So, Joe, you've got this all over the place, the New York Times leading the way, but now other publications with these stories of the Trump White House leaking out that they never wanted to do this in the first place.
This was obvious. I mean, this, again, this isn't us Monday morning quarterbacking. Go back from the very beginning. This was such an obviously stupid play done by somebody or a group of people that didn't know how Washington worked. We said it time and time again. They could not lead with health care. And when they decided to lead with health care, why did they decide to lead with Paul Ryan's version of health care? It was completely opposite of what Donald Trump promised every day on the campaign trail. Jeremy Peters, it made no sense. But so much of this was the same mistake that neophyte Republicans make, or neophyte presidents make when they come into Washington, D.C. And everybody says, oh, you know, you really need to listen to the Speaker. You really need to follow the House and the Senate. They really know best, which is what Bill Clinton did in '93 and '94. And Bill Clinton ended up getting destroyed because he went too far left. Donald Trump should not have listened to members of the House and the Senate that said, I know this sounds cold, but they said, well, we've been promising to repeal Obamacare for 6 years. Well, guess what? That's their problem. That's not the President of the United States' problem. His problem is getting momentum legislatively, passing tax reform, passing regulatory reform, getting the wind behind their backs, letting Ryan fight with John McCain and others in the Senate. They come together with a bill, and then he comes in at the end and plays peacemaker. This was so obvious for anybody who knows how Washington works. Jeremy, but it's a lot tougher than it looks on TV, isn't it?
Well, I think it was pretty clear from the beginning, Joe, that the votes weren't there for repeal because you had pressure from both sides, from the moderate and side of the caucus and from the far right side of the caucus. And still, this remains a group on the right in the Freedom Caucus that cannot get to yes. They cannot get to yes on most major pieces of legislation. They have a speaker that they don't fully trust. And the writing was on the wall, I think, from day one that this was not going to work. So the White House listened to Paul Ryan and said, okay, you know, we'll go along with this. And that was because of some of the pressure that existed for this bill. A lot of it was artificial. A lot of it was from the outside groups who said, you know, you guys have to do this. You promised. The Kochs were putting a lot of money behind this. FreedomWorks Heritage Foundation. I mean, it was a swell of pressure. That said, there were a lot of members who also felt like if they promised voters one thing over the last 6-7 years, it was that they would repeal Obamacare. But now, from what I'm hearing inside the White House, they're ready to move on. They're ready to move on from to tax reform. When the president meets at 12:30 before this vote, to have a lunch with Steve Mnuchin, the first thing on their agenda, I'm told, is tax reform. And that's where we're going from here.
So, at least maybe this bill passes sometime later this afternoon, but it seems to me the ask from the White House and from Paul Ryan of these congressional Republicans who are still no and need to get to yes is to vote on a bill that hasn't been scored by the CBO, that you haven't really had time to read through and process, and that is wildly unpopular. Oh, and by the way, that's probably going to die in the Senate anyway.
So what's their incentive for getting behind this, bill of goods that they have no idea what's in it, and the parts that are in it are deeply unpopular with the American public? The Freedom Caucus is pushing so hard to get rid of the stipulations about pre-existing conditions and about children who are with their parents under 26 staying on insurance. That's widely popular among the political spectrum, and they want to push to get that out. So it just seems like a lot of effort has been put into, kind of stripping Obamacare of some of the most popular elements, and not enough to, actually look at cost control and actually free market reforms that would help improve coverage.
Yeah, and that, at least that is the important thing. No free market reforms here that conservatives, that real conservatives would be excited about, that Heritage would be excited about, that the Freedom Caucus would be excited about, that Americans for Prosperity would be. So why does a conservative put their political career on the line getting behind this bad bill. And, you know, last night the CBO numbers, Steve Ratner, come out, and it ends up, we don't know the exact numbers, but the guesses are that the changes will actually not improve coverage, but will actually make the deficit go up even higher. Take us behind the CBO numbers. It looks bleak there, too.
Well, as you know, when the CBO report originally came out, they said it would improve the deficit by something like $337 billion. Now they're saying it's $150 billion. $50 billion of that, roughly, is simply giving more tax cuts to the rich. That's obviously not going to improve health care. They created a little bit of a piggy bank for the Senate, a little bit of legislative sleight of hand for the Senate to then give back to the House that might improve coverage at the margin. But the cold, hard fact is that there's nothing that the Freedom Caucus and the other far-right conservatives want that would actually improve the number of people on Obamacare, on health care. And in fact, the CBO scored this as being no change in the number of people on health care. What they're trying to do is, in effect, roll back the whole insurance market, whether it's pre-existing conditions, whether it's kids under 26, whether it's 10 essential benefits, back to where it was before Obama, which means that essentially you have a health care system of what it was like before Obama. 24 million people, fewer people insured, a lot of them on very inadequate plans that don't cover all kinds of things. And that's the vision they have. And as the polls that we talked about at the top of the show, that is not the vision that America has, where Obamacare for the first time is actually significantly more popular than unpopular, while this plan is unbelievably unpopular.
So Eddie and Elise both. Eddie, I'll ask you first. Whatever happens today, passage or no passage, where does this leave President Trump 2 months into his administration? This is the first big bite he took. He struggled through it, obviously. Where does he stand next week now as he tries to move forward? Is he weakened by this process over the last couple months?
I think he is. The idea of President Trump as the closer seems to be called into question now. The idea of him being the master of the art of the deal seems to be called into question at this point. And I think there are two major areas here. There's the issue around process and the issue around content. What we see with the legislation, to my mind, is a kind of cool-hearted piece of legislation. What David Brooks said in his op-ed in the New York Times, he says what? He says that this bill takes the most vicious progressive stereotypes about conservatives and validates them. That's the first thing. So there's a sense in which how cold-hearted it is. And then process. This seems to be a duplication of the very mistake that President Obama made with Obamacare. That seems to suggest that perhaps Trump isn't as distinct and unique as he says he is.
But, you know, I think at the point he's at, this calling for the vote today is not a stupid thing. I mean, I do deals, he does deals. It comes a point where it's going the wrong way, it's starting to unravel, things are getting worse, more and more numbers coming out that are bad, losing moderates as you try to get conservatives. At some point you have to call the question.
Well, yeah, and in a lot of ways, Steve, if this passes the House, it gets even messier. I think if it fails this afternoon at 3 p.m. when they have the vote, then they can move on to something else very easily. If it passes and it goes into the Senate, then you just have another extended, drawn-out fight among Republicans over what health care reform looks like, and the White House doesn't want that.
Sure, but you got to fight one fight at a time, I think, and I do think losing the House would be a disaster for the president.
I've got to say, I actually think, again, going back to what I said at the top of the show, in politics, sometimes when you lose, you win. I think the best thing that could happen is this bill goes down today. Actually, that they pull it. Yeah. Let them start renegotiating from the very beginning, do it the right way, and move on to tax reform, something that will unite all conservatives.
Joe, I agree, and I think that in the end, while this isn't great for President Trump, it's better for him than it is for Speaker Ryan. You know, he's already loathed by so much of the Tea Party base and viewed with a lot of mistrust. And this kind, the one thing that the establishment has looked for is at least able to, get together a coalition and get the votes. And on this critical first test, he really probably will have failed unless something does change over the course of today.
All right, we've got a busy morning ahead. We'll get more on the administration's strategy ahead of today's new planned vote. Health and Human Services Secretary Tom Price joins us in our 7 o'clock hour. And the latest revelations from House Intel Chair Devin Nunes, who yesterday apologized to the rest of his committee. You're watching Morning Joe. We'll be right back.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.